Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a journey into the story of an entity that once spanned the globe, controlling over a quarter of the world's land and population.
It's a story that's, well, incredibly complex. A narrative woven from threads of, yes, immense human achievement and strategic brilliance, but also, unequivocally, from the darkest chapters of exploitation and violence.
It's a paradox that continues to fascinate, doesn't it? How did a relatively small island nation manage to achieve such unparalleled global reach?
And perhaps even more intriguingly, what forces, both internal and external, eventually led to its decline and ultimate dissolution. These are complex questions, and to truly grasp them, you really need to go far beyond the surface.
That's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going to systematically unpack the British Empire.
Yeah.
What it fundamentally was, the foundational moments that spurred its astonishing expansion, the diverse, often brutal colonial practices that defined its relationship with indigenous populations, and finally, the forces that led to its eventual winding down.
And we have a wealth of historical accounts and detailed narratives to draw from.
Exactly. So we're confident this will be a comprehensive look at one of history's most monumental powers. Let's begin.
Okay, so to truly understand this historical colossus, we first need to define it. What exactly was the British Empire, and what was its sheer scale?
Right. At its core, the British Empire was a vast global system of dependencies. Colonies, protectorates, various other territories, all brought under the sovereignty of the British Crown and administered by the British government over roughly 3 centuries.
So not just one thing, but a network.
Exactly. Think of it less as a single unified entity and more as a sprawling network, interconnected by trade, law, and military might, with London really at its heart.
And when we talk about its sheer size, it's almost difficult to fully grasp. By the late 19th century, it was truly immense.
Oh, absolutely. By the end of the 19th century, the empire covered nearly 1/4 of the world's entire land surface.
A quarter of the land. And perhaps even more strikingly, it encompassed more than 1/4 of the planet's total population. The saying, "the sun never set on the British Empire," became a powerful, if sometimes chilling, descriptor of its omnipresence.
That immense scale, with territories so far flung, must have presented unique challenges for governance. How did such a vast system manage to hold together? And, well, how did it eventually evolve?
It posed significant challenges, definitely. A centralized, rigid control simply wasn't sustainable over such distances and diverse cultures. This led to a gradual policy of granting or recognizing significant degrees of self-government, particularly for the white settler colonies.
Okay.
By the 20th century, this evolved into the concept of a British Commonwealth, which was formally recognized in statute in 1931. After 1946, the British adjective was dropped, and today, the Commonwealth is a free association of sovereign states, largely former elements of the empire, maintaining a voluntary association. It's a fascinating journey from direct rule to a more symbolic, collaborative tie.
What's also intriguing is that this wasn't a pre-planned, centralized project from day one. It wasn't as if a monarch woke up and declared, "Let's build a global empire." It seems much more haphazard in its beginnings.
Precisely. The earliest overseas settlements in the 16th and 17th centuries were more tentative efforts, driven largely by individual enterprise or powerful commercial companies rather than direct crown initiative.
Like the East India Company.
Exactly. Consider the East India Company, which began establishing trading posts in India around 1600, leading eventually to the street settlements like Penang, Singapore, Malacca, or the Hudson's Bay Company in northwestern Canada from the 1670s. These were private ventures seeking commercial opportunities. The Crown often became involved later, formalizing control when it became necessary to protect those profits or assert strategic influence. It was initially a rather unorganized process based on piecemeal acquisition.
So if direct crown initiative wasn't always the driving force, how did the Crown exert control over these burgeoning territories, especially regarding their economic output?
Well, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Crown's primary method of control was through regulating trade and shipping, following what was known as mercantilist philosophy.
Mercantilism, right.
Yeah. This economic theory saw colonies as vital sources of necessary raw materials for England, things like tobacco, sugar. These colonies were granted monopolies in the British market, but in return, they were expected to conduct all their trade using English ships and to serve as captive markets for British manufactured goods. It was a closed economic system designed purely to maximize wealth and power for Britain.
And this system wasn't just an informal understanding. There was specific legislation to enforce it, wasn't there?
Yes, absolutely. The Navigation Act of 1651 and subsequent similar acts created this closed economy between Britain and its colonies. This meant, legally, all colonial exports had to be shipped on English ships to the British market, and all colonial imports had to come by way of England.
Very restrictive.
Extremely. This system, which rigidly controlled colonial trade for Britain's direct benefit, only began to seriously unravel in the first half of the 19th century. That's when ideas from thinkers like Scottish economist Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, coupled with the significant loss of the American colonies and a growing free trade movement back in Britain, started to really challenge its core tenets.
It's clear that this initial economic rationale, though seemingly haphazard at first, laid crucial groundwork for future imperial policies and, as we'll definitely see, would often be the root cause of later conflicts, as colonial identities began to chafe under such restrictive controls.
It certainly set a powerful precedent for resource extraction and economic dependence, shaping the dynamic between colony and metropole for centuries to come.
Okay, we've established what the British Empire became. But to understand how it rose, we really need to trace its earliest foundations. It wasn't a sudden global leap. England first had to consolidate its power closer to home. How far back do these roots go?
We can trace this back to the very origins of England itself, long, long before any global ambitions. Imagine 878 AD, King Alfred the Great defending his small Anglo-Saxon kingdom against invading Danish Vikings.
Right, Alfred the Great.
He was famously forced to retreat to the Isle of Athelney, but from there he regrouped and achieved a decisive victory over the Viking leader Guthrum at Edington. This led to the Treaty of Wedmore, which, while recognizing some Viking rule in the Danelaw, critically secured peace and allowed Alfred to begin unifying the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
And his vision of a unified England was eventually realized by his grandson, Athelstan.
Exactly. Athelstan, in 927 AD, after conquering Northumbria, truly unified England under his rule, becoming the first king of England. This foundational strength was essential before England could even think about looking beyond its shores.
So once England was a more cohesive entity, its first steps towards colonization were actually within its immediate vicinity, Ireland and Wales.
That's a crucial point. England's first formal colony wasn't overseas at all. 2 centuries after Alfred, in 1171 AD, King Henry II sailed to Waterford, Ireland, to assert his authority. At the Senate of Cashel, Irish bishops and clergymen recognized Henry II as the sovereign ruler of Ireland.
Making Ireland the first colony. Wow.
Making Ireland England's first colony, a precursor to its global empire by centuries. Then, in 1277, King Edward I, driven by, well, strategic, political, and territorial motivations, launched the First Welsh War against Prince Llewellyn. After his victory, Edward employed a strategic, multi-pronged approach, building a network of imposing fortresses across Wales to solidify English dominance. Following a second Welsh War in 1282, Wales was formally made part of the English kingdom. These early conquests were brutal, yes, but provided invaluable lessons in imperial control.
Yet these internal struggles and expansions also held England back, didn't they? Causing them to miss out on the initial waves of global exploration.
They absolutely did. England was deeply embroiled in the Hundred Years' War with France, spanning from 1337 to 1453, and almost immediately after, the devastating War of the Roses from 1455 to 1487. These prolonged internal conflicts kept England tied to their tiny island, essentially. While Spain and Portugal were charting new trade routes and claiming vast territories across the oceans, England was consumed by its own battles, effectively missing those early opportunities for overseas expansion.
And then the world dramatically expanded with Christopher Columbus's voyages, fundamentally shifting Europe's perspective.
The landing of Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas in 1492 and his subsequent exploration of the Caribbean and coasts of Central and South America was a revelation. This discovery of a massive landmass in the West immediately ignited a fierce desire for land within the British government, spurring their own ambitions to catch up.
So, England quickly dispatched its own explorer, Giovanni Caboto, or John Cabot, to stake a claim in this new world.
Yes. John Cabot sought and received a patent from King Henry VII to find a direct route to Asia and explore the new continent. In May 1497, Cabot set sail. On June 24, 1497, he sighted and landed on Newfoundland on the eastern coast of North America. Here, he encountered indigenous peoples, likely the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq, and claimed the land for England, planting the flag. While his second voyage in 1498 remains less certain, this initial claim was a symbolic, if tentative, step onto the global stage.
A major factor that began to truly propel England's imperial ambitions was also profoundly linked to religious and political shifts back home, specifically Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church.
This was a seismic event. King Henry VIII's desperate desire for a male heir, and the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a refusal heavily influenced by the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, led Henry to make a momentous decision.
The break with Rome.
Exactly. In 1534, Henry broke from Rome. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, establishing the Church of England with the king as its spiritual head, giving birth to Anglicanism. After his daughter Mary briefly attempted to restore Catholicism, her half-sister Elizabeth I solidified England as a Protestant state in 1559 through the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity. This religious divide fueled much of England's later conflict with Catholic powers like Spain, pushing them towards overseas expansion.
And with other European powers already establishing colonies, Queen Elizabeth I quickly moved to challenge Spanish dominance, commissioning what became known as the Sea Dogs.
The Sea Dogs were Queen Elizabeth's daring answer to the established colonial powers. These were privateers, like Sir Francis Drake, whom she granted legal access to pillage and loot all Spanish ships. This era also marks a truly horrific moment, England's formal entry into the transatlantic slave trade.
One of the earliest and most notorious figures in this was John Hawkins. Could you tell us more about his role?
John Hawkins, a former pardoned killer, joined the Royal Navy. In 1561, during a voyage to the Canary Islands, he learned about the lucrative business of capturing and selling people into slavery. His first voyage in 1562 to Sierra Leone was chillingly efficient. He captured around 300 Africans, sailed them to the Caribbean, and without formal permission, sold them in places like Isabela and Puerto de Plata for valuable pearls, hides, and sugar.
And he was knighted for this.
The profits were so immense that he was knighted upon his return. His subsequent voyages, like the second in 1564 where he took over 400 enslaved people, and a third in 1568 involving forced kidnappings near Cape Verde with the help of a local king, illustrate his brutal methods. This established a terrifying precedent. Slavery was a lucrative business, and the English would do anything to protect it, even resorting to force, as seen when he collaborated with Francis Drake to coerce trade at Rio de la Hacha.
That's a grim but vital detail to remember about the empire's foundations. And then we have Francis Drake, whose circumnavigation of the globe truly announced England's rising global ambitions.
Indeed. In 1577, Queen Elizabeth commissioned Francis Drake to find a new trade passage to Asia by circumnavigating the Americas. His journey was epic and fraught with peril. He sailed around the formidable Cape Horn and through the Strait of Magellan into the Pacific. He explored Nova Albion, modern-day California, before crossing the Pacific to the Spice Islands in Indonesia for valuable trade. His return in 1580, around the Cape of Good Hope, completed the circumnavigation of the world, a monumental feat that earned him a knighthood as Sir Francis Drake and unequivocally signaled England's burgeoning global reach and naval prowess.
With this expanding global perspective, England knew it needed to establish permanent overseas settlements. However, their early attempts, like the Roanoke colony, faced significant challenges.
Yes, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter in 1584 to colonize the New World. The first expedition to Roanoke Island in 1585, led by Sir Richard Grenville, consisted of 100 men. They faced harsh conditions, including disease and food shortages, and the relationship with local Native American tribes grew increasingly tense. Even Sir Francis Drake, upon returning from his circumnavigation, offered to take many settlers back in 1586, highlighting the colony's struggles. Raleigh's second attempt in 1587, famously known as the Lost Colony after it was found abandoned 3 years later, served as a stark reminder of the immense difficulties and perils of early overseas colonization.
But the defining moment for England's rise as a naval power and its claim to global influence came in 1588 with the monumental defeat of the Spanish Armada.
This was a truly pivotal event. King Philip II of Spain, driven by a desire to take over England in the name of Catholicism, assembled the Spanish Armada, a truly formidable force of around 130 ships and over 30,000 soldiers. But Queen Elizabeth, with commanders like Sir Francis Drake and Charles Howard, prepared the English fleet. Despite being smaller, the English ships possessed superior maneuverability and firepower. Their tactics were brilliant. They harassed the Armada from the rear, firing salvos, and crucially sent 8 fire ships towards the Armada in the English Channel, causing the Spanish formation to break in panic. The Battle of Gravlands on July 29, 1588, saw innovative naval tactics lead to a decisive English victory. The remnants of the Armada faced a harrowing journey back to Spain due to severe storms, marking the definitive end of Spanish naval dominance and the clear rise of England as a major sea power.
And even as England looked outward, it continued to assert and consolidate its power closer to home, particularly in Ireland, through conflicts like the Nine Years' War.
The 9 Years' War in Ireland, from 1594 to 1603, was another brutal chapter in England's internal colonization. Ireland was divided between the English-controlled Pale and the autonomous Gaelic Irish regions governed by traditional Brehon law. English policies that threatened the Irish way of life led to escalating tensions, culminating in a rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Hugh O'Donnell. Despite a brief Spanish aid in 1601, the Irish suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Kinsale. The subsequent Treaty of Mellifont in 1603, while offering pardons, systematically aimed to destroy the Gaelic language and strongly discourage Catholicism, with the explicit goal of transforming Ireland into an Anglo-Saxon country. These early internal and external conflicts, often driven by a mix of religious conviction and territorial ambition, profoundly shaped England's military and naval strength, effectively paving the way for its more organized global expansion.
So it's clear the empire's foundations were laid in a mix of ambitious ventures, internal struggles, and an increasingly brutal embrace of tactics, particularly concerning the slave trade from its very beginnings. This was a blueprint for what was to come.
A blueprint indeed shaped by commercial imperatives, religious fervor, and a consistent willingness to exert overwhelming force against any perceived obstacle or opportunity, whether it was within their own island or across distant oceans.
Okay, with naval supremacy established and a clearer global ambition, England shifted from those early, often failed attempts like Roanoke to establishing its first truly permanent and successful overseas colonies. Jamestown in Virginia, 1607, is often seen as the starting gun for English America. But it was anything but a smooth beginning, was it?
Far from it. The Virginia Company of London, formed in 1606, financed the expedition to find wealth and perhaps a passage to the Pacific. The 104 settlers who arrived on May 13, 1607, at a marshy peninsula they named Jamestown, immediately faced a harsh reality. The climate was unbearable, diseases like malaria and dysentery were rampant, and hunger was a constant companion.
The starving time.
Exactly. The starving time of 1609 was particularly grim, a period of desperation where colonists were reduced to eating whatever they could find, even horses, pets, and leather. Initial interactions with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy were marked by misunderstandings and mistrust, often escalating into violent clashes.
But then an unexpected cash crop changed everything for Jamestown. Tobacco, right?
It did. John Rolfe's introduction of tobacco cultivation was the lifeline. It thrived in the Virginia soil and climate, bringing financial prosperity to the struggling colony. This success attracted more settlers and finally allowed a viable English colony to be established on American soil, demonstrating the immense economic potential that would drive further colonial ventures.
And simultaneously across the world, the East India Company was making its initial crucial inroads into India, initially through trade rather than direct conquest.
Exactly. Merchant William Hawkins's mission in 1607 took him to the prosperous port of Surat in 1608, where he met the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. By 1612, the English East India Company secured an agreement to establish a permanent trading post there, exchanging English goods like weapons and metalware for valuable Indian textiles, spices, and indigo. Sir Thomas Roe's diplomatic mission in 1615 further solidified English trade and influence at Jahangir's court. These were strategic, seemingly humble footholds, but they laid crucial groundwork for much deeper British involvement and eventual dominance in India.
While some were driven by the pursuit of profit, others were motivated by a very different, deeply personal ideal: religious freedom. The Pilgrims, sailing on the Mayflower in 1620, represent this alternative yet equally significant motivation for colonization.
A stark contrast, indeed. King James's insistence on Anglican conformity forced dissenting groups like the Pilgrims to seek refuge in the New World. The Mayflower voyage in 1620 was a perilous undertaking. They faced leaks on their companionship, the speedwell, dwindling rations, a badly damaged main beam on the Mayflower itself.
Right, fixed with a metal screw, wasn't it?
Yes, and they faced crowding, unsanitary conditions and seasickness. Despite arriving at Cape Cod in November with only 47 survivors by March, their resilience and their profound purpose to create a new civilization for God saw them establish Plymouth. This was a settlement driven by deeply held spiritual beliefs, a truly different impulse compared to Jamestown.
Then we have the Caribbean, where the drive for colonization and the horrific expansion of the slave trade became inextricably linked, often with brutal and immediate consequences.
The Caribbean islands, with their fertile soil, proved incredibly valuable for cash crops like tobacco and later sugar, which created an immense, insatiable demand for labor. Thomas Warner established St. Christopher or St. Kitts in 1624. Fear of the native Kalinago tribe initially led to a joint colony with the French in 1625. However, the true horror unfolded in 1626.
This is the massacre you mentioned.
Yes. After a Kalinago plot to attack Europeans was reportedly betrayed by an Igneri woman named Babe, English and French forces launched a shocking preemptive strike. They massacred between 100 and 120 Caribs in their beds that night, sparing only the most beautiful Kalinago women to serve as slaves. The following day, the brutality continued, with roughly 4,000 Kalinago natives killed while attempting to surrender, resulting in piles and piles of dead, rotting bodies, and places grimly named Bloody Point and Bloody River.
That level of violence is truly shocking, a direct extermination.
It's a dark stain on this period. This brutal elimination of the indigenous population left a nasty problem of labor for the burgeoning tobacco farms, which immediately led to a high demand for forcibly enslaved Africans. Other English settlements quickly followed, like Barbados in 1625, Nevis in 1627, and Montserrat and Antigua in 1632, all demonstrating Britain's relentless determination to profit from the Caribbean, regardless of the unimaginable human costs.
This period truly illustrates a diverse set of motivations for colonization. Some idealistic, others purely exploitative, but all contributing to the empire's rapid expansion.
Absolutely. And the Great Migration of Puritans to the Massachusetts Bay Colony beginning in 1630 is another powerful example of religiously motivated settlement. King Charles I increased hatred for non-Anglicans, and his dissolution of Parliament drove Puritan leaders like John Winthrop to seek refuge in the New World. Winthrop and 700 settlers left in 1630, landing in Salem, Massachusetts. Winthrop's famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, articulated a vision for a community not merely focused on money-making, but driven by a strict moral code and a desire to change the world by setting an example.
The city upon a hill idea.
Exactly. This led to the Great Migration of around 20,000 Puritans over the next decade, who further dispersed to found new colonies like Connecticut under Thomas Hooker and Rhode Island under Roger Williams due to slight religious differences, creating more cities on a hill.
And a final significant early colony was Maryland, founded specifically as a haven for Catholics.
Yes. Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, received a charter for Maryland in 1632, named in honor of the Catholic Queen Henrietta Maria. In 1634, settlers, a mix of Catholics seeking religious freedom and Protestants hoping for economic opportunities, established St. Mary's City. This era truly captures the contrasting motivations for English expansion, from raw profit to deeply held religious ideals, and how both impulses fueled rapid expansion, often with devastating consequences for indigenous populations and, as we've seen, the horrifying origins of the transatlantic slave trade becoming a core economic driver.
Okay, so we've explored the empire's early, often brutal establishment. Now let's see how these nascent footholds began to consolidate into a more formal imperial structure, particularly through intense conflict and shifting power dynamics in the mid-17th to early 18th centuries. India once again becomes a critical point of expansion for British influence.
Indeed. The British East India Company's burgeoning trade in India created a strong desire for a tiny parcel of land within the Indian subcontinent to secure its interests as trade eclipsed other European ventures. So, in 1639, Francis Day and Andrew Cogan were sent to the Coromandel coast. Through negotiations with local Nayak rulers in Masulipatam, they secured land to establish what began as a humble trading post.
Which became Fort St. George.
Exactly. This soon transformed into more substantial buildings and defensive walls, becoming Fort St. George, a strategic center of influence and a tangible manifestation of the company's growing ambitions, especially given the intensifying rivalries with Portuguese and Dutch traders.
But back in England, political instability was brewing, leading to the devastating English Civil War. This internal conflict profoundly reshaped British governance and had massive implications for the empire's future.
The English Civil War, from 1642 to 1651, was a true watershed moment. The trigger was King Charles I's failed attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in January 1642, igniting a direct confrontation between the Crown and Parliament.
Parliament's demands were quite radical for the time.
They were. The 19 Propositions in June 1642 demanded significant parliamentary power increases, strict anti-Catholic laws, removal of Catholic lords, and even Protestant education for Catholic children. Charles, of course, responded defiantly. Nolumus legis Angliae mutari. We are unwilling to change the laws of England. While initial battles saw some royalist victories, the tide turned in 1644, with parliamentarian gains culminating in Oliver Cromwell's military genius emerging at Marston Moor.
And Naseby was the knockout blow.
The decisive Battle of Naseby in June 1645 saw Cromwell's new model army and its formidable Ironsides cavalry achieve a crushing victory, leading to King Charles's capture. He was later tried for high treason in Westminster Hall, found guilty, and famously executed, marking a profound shift from absolutism to a new era of governance, the era of Oliver Cromwell.
And Cromwell's rule as Lord Protectorate had a truly brutal and far-reaching impact, not just within England, but on British policies across the Isles and beyond.
His impact was profound and, for many, devastating. In Ireland, Cromwell, a staunch Puritan, was convinced that Catholicism needed to be quelled. Landing in Dublin in August 1649, his forces brutally captured Drogheda in September 1649, killing an estimated 3,500 people, including civilians and priests.
And Wexford.
In October 1649, Wexford suffered a similar fate, with around 3,500 killed and the town burned to ashes. In Scotland, he defeated forces supporting Charles II at Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651. Following these conquests, the public practice of Roman Catholicism was banned in Ireland, Catholic priests were killed when captured, and essentially all Catholic-owned land was confiscated under the Act for the Settlement of Ireland of 1652, redistributed to British settlers and soldiers. Presbyterianism was also deemed illegal in Scotland.
He even attempted a form of social engineering in Scotland, fundamentally altering their society.
Yes, Cromwell actively sought to dismantle the traditional Scottish clan system. He granted land titles directly to clan chiefs, effectively creating a Scottish noble class and dispossessing many impoverished, non-landowning Scotsmen. This fundamentally shifted land use from communal survival to profit-driven enterprises, leading to things like cutting down giant swaths of Scottish trees, turning ancient rainforests into hilly, grassy fields to raise sheep. For many Scots, this was viewed as a profound betrayal and a deliberate attempt to ruin their entire society by imposing English ideals and economic models.
But Cromwell's ambitions weren't limited to the British Isles. He also made significant overseas acquisitions, notably capturing Jamaica.
He certainly did. Cromwell launched his Western Design Armada with the aim of challenging Spanish control in the Caribbean. After a failed attack on Santo Domingo, they turned their attention to the sparsely populated island of Jamaica in May 1655, successfully capturing it. Jamaica was then quickly put to work, serving as a destination for indentured servants, including prisoners of war and disobedient subjects, all coerced into grueling sugarcane production.
After Cromwell's era, the monarchy was restored with King Charles II, who wasted no time in picking up the threads of imperial expansion.
King Charles II, restored to the throne in 1660, was, as the source says, dead set on bringing England to the rest of the world and restoring its prestige. In Africa, he established the Company of Royal Adventurers trading into Africa in 1660, granting it a complete monopoly of the gold trade and, crucially, access to the ever-lucrative slave trade in 1663. In the Americas, he expanded British claims by establishing the province of Carolina, named after itself, which covered a vast area and was designed as a buffer between the growing Spanish land grab in Florida.
This era also saw fierce competition with the Dutch, particularly for control of valuable colonial outposts like New York.
The Anglo-Dutch Wars were a direct consequence of this intense competition for resources and trade. In 1664, Captain Robert Holmes seized several Dutch forts in Africa, including the strategically important Cape Coast Castle. In America, the English set their sights on the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. Colonel Richard Nicolls arrived with warships in 1664, and the Dutch, facing overwhelming force, accepted lenient terms of surrender that guaranteed their property rights and religious freedom. New Amsterdam was then triumphantly renamed New York.
Though the Dutch tried to fight back.
Yes, Dutch Admiral Mikkel de Ruyter later managed to retake some African forts except Cape Coast, and even arrived off Barbados. But despite orders to retake New York, his fleet was too weakened. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 ultimately confirmed English control of the former New Netherlands, while the Dutch regained Suriname in South America, effectively clearing the path to further colonization in the Americas for Britain.
And further north in Canada, we see the rise of the Hudson's Bay Company and the booming fur trade.
Yes. While the French in Montreal were focused on fur trading, two French fur traders, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Medard de Grassellier, learned from the native Cree that even richer, premium furs were available in the north and west of Lake Superior in the vast Hudson Bay region. After being arrested by French authorities for unlicensed trading, they sought English sponsorship, eventually gaining the backing of Prince Rupert, Charles II's cousin. The 1668 English expedition with the Nonsuch and Eaglet led to the establishment of Charles Fort on James Bay. The Nonsuch's return in 1669 with a cargo of furs worth over 188,000 pounds today proved the venture's immense profitability. King Charles II then granted a monopoly over the region to the Hudson Bay Company, which remarkably still exists today. This segment truly highlights how deeply intertwined internal British politics, religious conflicts, and strategic overseas expansion became. Military power, lucrative economic incentives, and even religious motives drove distinct waves of colonization, often with devastating consequences for indigenous populations.
It's a clear pattern emerging. Consolidate power, identify resources, exert control, and repeat. This period solidified the empire's foundation.
A powerful feedback loop that would define much of the imperial project for centuries.
So, by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the British Empire was firmly establishing itself. But this relentless growth also led to mounting tensions and new conflicts, often laying the seeds for its future decline. In New England, for instance, rapid colonial growth ignited a brutal clash known as King Philip's War.
This was a direct and tragic consequence of unchecked expansion. The Massachusetts Bay Colony exploded in population, growing from a mere 180 people in 1624 to 64,000 by 1675. This rapid growth created an immense demand for land, pushing colonists further into the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag Confederacy.
And the core issue was about land ownership, fundamentally.
Exactly. While initial relations with the Pilgrims were friendly, they soured dramatically due to fundamental differences in how land and property worked. English colonists viewed land as individual private property, natives as a communal resource. This led to confusion and a lack of understanding, and Native Americans increasingly believed their land was being stolen unjustly. The catalyst for the war was the execution of 3 Wampanoag men by English authorities in 1675 for the murder of a Christianized Native American, an act that outraged Metacom, or King Philip, who then led coordinated attacks on Plymouth colony towns like Swansea and Taunton.
This sounds like a truly devastating conflict for everyone involved.
It was indeed. Both sides endured horrific, harsh conditions, rampant disease, and starvation. Other Native American tribes, seeing the existential threat, joined Metacom's alliance, leading to brutal engagements like the infamous Battle of Great Swamp, where Narragansett Fort was captured. The English, for their part, shrewdly negotiated a treaty with the Mohawk tribe to gain a critical advantage. Metacom's eventual assassination in 1676 by John Alderman, a praying Indian, marked a turning point, and the war officially concluded in August 1676 with the Treaty of Casco. This treaty allowed English to remain on all native lands for a light tribute of 1 peck of corn per English family, a relatively insignificant amount, but one that cemented English presence.
Meanwhile, a very different kind of colonial experiment was taking shape in Pennsylvania, offering a stark contrast to the violence elsewhere.
Yes, William Penn's Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania, founded in 1681, stands out. It was a haven for Quakers, an extreme religious group who challenged Anglicanism with concepts like inner light, direct communication with God without clergy or king, and rejection of formal titles. King Charles would just be Charles. Penn leveraged a substantial debt. King Charles II owed his father 16,000 pounds, or about 2.8 million pounds a day, to acquire the land.
A debt paid in land.
Precisely. Charles II signed the order on March 4, 1681, creating the colony of Pennsylvania. Penn arrived in October 1682, famously naming Philadelphia the city of brotherly love, envisioning a place where all people, regardless of race, creed, religion, or gender, could prosper, where no one would be unfairly prosecuted, and a white man and a black man could shake hands as equals. Penn referred to it as a holy experiment based on the Quaker tenet that all people are equal under the eyes of God.
But the relative peace of Pennsylvania was quickly overshadowed by major political upheaval back in England, the Glorious Revolution. And this, of course, had profound global echoes.
Absolutely. The calm after Charles II's death in 1685 were shattered when his staunch Roman Catholic brother, James II, ascended to the throne. James's appointment of Catholics to powerful positions, violating the Test Act, and the subsequent birth of a Catholic heir truly set the kingdom on edge, sparking widespread fears of a permanent Catholic dynasty. In response, a group known as the Immortal Seven, prominent nobles and political leaders, invited Prince William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to England.
And it was surprisingly bloodless, wasn't it?
Remarkably so. William's arrival in 1688 was met with surprising lack of resistance, as James's supporters defected, leading to James II's flight to France. This bloodless revolution fundamentally reshaped British governance. Parliament seized the moment, passing the Bill of Rights in 1689, a cornerstone of constitutional principles, establishing the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy, curbing the monarch's power, and protecting crucial individual rights. This constitutional shift had immediate repercussions across the Atlantic, with Protestant settlers in New York revolting against Catholic Governor Jacob Leisler, and in Massachusetts, English in Boston overthrowing Catholic Governor Sir Edmund Andros, both declaring loyalty to William and Mary and restoring previous political structures.
And it directly led to a wider European and global conflict, the 9 Years' War, also known as King William's War.
Exactly. The French Catholics, viewing this as an attack on their faith, decided to fight back. However, most of Europe was pinned against them in the Grand Alliance: England, Dutch Republic, Holy Roman Empire, Spain. Battles raged across Europe, including the Battle of Fleurus in the Spanish Netherlands, a French victory, and the pivotal Battle of the Boyne in Ireland, where King William III defeated the deposed Catholic King James II, securing his hold on the English and Irish thrones. The war also spread to the Americas, with clashes erupting in 1690, including the Battle of Port Royal, an English failure to capture Acadia, French and Abenaki raids in Maine, the Siege of Pemaquid, and the Battle of Quebec, where an English expedition failed to capture the French stronghold, creating a firm boundary between the two nations' colonies. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 officially declared William of Orange leader of England and stopped the French offensive.
And amidst all these European and American conflicts, Britain faced its first major military setback in India against the formidable Mughal Empire.
Yes, during this same period, the First Anglo-Mughal War, also known as Child's War, erupted between 1686 and 1690. The English East India Company, despite its thriving trade monopoly, pushed for more. They demanded ownership of Chittagong, a fortified enclave, and sought independence from Mughal territorial jurisdiction. Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb flatly refused, leading the East India Company Navy to blockade several Mughal ports. Aurangzeb swiftly retaliated, seizing company factories and arresting members. A Mughal fleet then blockaded the East India Company fort in Bombay in 1690. After a year of resistance, marked by famine, the company was forced to surrender, sending envoys to Aurangzeb's court to plead for a pardon. They paid a hefty imperial fine of 150,000 rupees, equivalent to 4.4 million today. Aurangzeb lifted the siege, and the company re-established itself in Bombay and set up a new base in Calcutta. This setback forced the British to reconsider their aggressive tactics in India, at least temporarily.
Then we have a truly pivotal moment that profoundly shaped the modern British state. The Act of Union 1707, officially creating Great Britain.
This was monumental. Under Queen Anne, who ascended in 1702, the British Isles had a complex governmental structure. 4 kingdoms, 3 parliaments, 1 monarch. Scotland and Ireland had their own parliaments but were under the British monarch, while England and Wales shared a parliament. Scotland at the time was experiencing significant economic turmoil of corruption, resource depletion, and an increasingly powerful elite. This precarious situation was leveraged by the English. Wealthy Scottish officials were effectively bribed. For example, the Earl of Glasgow and the Duke of Queensberry received around £20,000, roughly £4 million today, to vote for the end of the Scottish Parliament.
So it wasn't exactly a popular union in Scotland.
Not universally, no. On May 1st, 1707, the Scottish and English parliaments formally combined to form the Parliament of Great Britain in Westminster. As any semblance of Scottish independence was gone, anger spread throughout Scotland, but nothing was done about it. For England, this uniting of Parliament created the term Great Britain was the beginning of the empire.
And this newly formed Great Britain immediately found itself in another major global conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession, also known as Queen Anne's War in America.
The peace after Ryswick was short-lived. In 1707, renewed conflict broke out, primarily over colonies in America, triggered by the succession issue in Spain after King Charles II died childless, with rival claims from Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou. The English feared a united French and Spanish throne would increase Catholicism's power worldwide, thus declaring war.
So European politics driving colonial warfare.
Precisely. In America, the French captured the English trading post of Fort Albany. But the English, under commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch, came to Acadia, Nova Scotia. The siege of Port Royal in October 1710 saw English warships besiege the French stronghold, leading to Governor Subercase's surrender. Acadia became Annapolis Royal. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 recognized Philip V as the King of Spain, but crucially it contained the Asiento de Negros provision.
The slave trade monopoly.
Yes. The Spanish often outsourced slave trading, and this treaty transferred the monopoly from the French to the English. This made England a leader in the lucrative and dehumanizing practice of the transatlantic slave trade. Additionally, the French ceded Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and territories in Rupert's Land, while the Spanish ceded Gibraltar and Minorca.
That transfer of the slave trade monopoly is a particularly chilling detail, directly exposing the engine of the empire's economic success. And it led to an intensification of brutal practices, as codified in the South Carolina slave codes of 1712.
These codes stand as a horrifying testament to the dehumanization central to the empire's economic model. South Carolina, fertile and great for sugarcane, became a jewel for the British Empire, leading to an increased demand for labor. To regulate this, the notorious slave codes of 1712 were passed. This nasty document explicitly outlined the slave-owning colonists' views, asserting that Negroes and other slaves are of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of this province.
Just horrific language.
Absolutely. The codes imposed incredibly harsh rules. Slaves forbidden to leave property unless with a white person or permission. Any white person, quote, required to chastise, whip such slaves if found without permission. The death penalty for attempting to run away or leave the colony, public whipping, branding with an R on the right cheek, ear loss, and even castration for repeated evasion. This code became the forefront of slave treatment within the American colonies and the rest of the world, viewing slaves as nothing more than tools for farmland to make a profit.
And the sheer scale of this human tragedy, particularly in the Caribbean, is staggering.
It's impossible to overstate. While approximately 40,000 slaves were in North America at the time, there were exponentially more in the Caribbean islands like Barbados and Jamaica due to the profitable yet labor-intensive crop of sugarcane. The cultivation process was grueling, clearing land, planting, weeding, hoeing, building canals, cutting, all in extreme heat, often for 18-hour days. Slaves would die left and right from malnourishment, overheating, and exhaustion. The English would enslave and transport around 200,000 Africans from 1710 to 1720 to the Americas just to ensure a constant supply of fresh labor. This period powerfully illustrates the consolidation of British power, the brutal realities of their colonial practices, and the undeniable economic motivations behind expanding and rigidly enforcing the slave trade. The deep moral compromises made in the relentless pursuit of wealth and global dominance are stark and undeniable.
So, as the British Empire solidified its control and expanded through warfare and brutal economic policies, it reached its zenith in the mid-18th century. Yet, ironically, this era of peak power also sowed some of the first, most significant seeds of its eventual decline. Let's start with Georgia, a colony that began with idealistic intentions but ultimately succumbed to the same economic pressures as others.
James Oglethorpe's vision for Georgia in 1732 was indeed unique. He aimed to create a colony for England's worthy poor and debtors, offering them a fresh start rather than imprisonment. When 144 colonists arrived in Savannah in 1733, Oglethorpe initially banned slavery, intending for small farms to provide comfortable living rather than generating immense wealth through forced labor.
And there was a strategic reason too, right? Fear of Spanish Florida.
Exactly. Spanish Florida offered freedom to any African slave who joined their army, meaning slavery in Georgia could inadvertently strengthen Spanish interests. However, this ban became a lost cause due to the unenforceable nature of the illegal importation of slaves from South Carolina. By January 1st, 1751, slavery was officially permitted with a code almost identical to South Carolina's. This shift ultimately hurt the worthy poor Oglethorpe intended to help, as wealthy South Carolinian migrants swiftly established socioeconomic structures and relationships nearly identical to those they had known, dominating the low-country Georgia's rice economy.
And speaking of Spanish Florida, tensions between Britain and Spain flared again in the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict that became a strange prelude to much wider global warfare.
That's right. The unusual trigger for this conflict was British merchant Robert Jenkins, notorious for raiding Spanish ships, having his ear severed by a Spanish privateer in 1731. He presented it to Parliament in 1738, sparking outrage and demands for retribution.
Jenkins' Ear. Quite the name.
Quite. After 8 years of failed peaceful resolution, war broke out in 1739. In America, Oglethorpe invaded Florida in January 1740, seizing Fort Picolata and Fort San Francisco de Pupo, but retreating from St. Augustine due to insufficient forces. The Spanish then assaulted St. Simon's Island in summer 1742, leading to the Battle of Bloody Marsh, where English forces repelled a Spanish regiment, forcing their retreat back to St. Augustine. But this conflict wasn't just localized, it extended to the Carnatic region of southern India.
Right, the proxy wars there.
Yes, the English, allied with Anwaruddin, fought the French, allied with Chanda Sahib. The French defeated the English at the Battle of Adyar in 1744 and captured Madras in 1746. The conflict even intertwined with the broader War of the Austrian Succession in Europe. Though the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 largely restored pre-war territorial shifts, returning Madras to British hands and establishing an official border between Georgia and Florida, it was clear that colonial ambitions were now inextricably linked to European power struggles.
All these regional conflicts truly were just a warm-up for what became the first truly global war, the 7 Years' War.
This was the defining conflict of the mid-18th century, a monumental struggle that spanned the Americas, Europe, and India. The flashpoint in North America was the Ohio Valley, a vast territory coveted for expansion by the Ohio Company of Virginia, but already home to Shawnee and Delaware tribes and French fur traders, with strategic forts like Fort Duquesne.
And George Washington was involved right at the start?
Yes, a young George Washington, just 22, was tasked with surveying and securing the valley. In April 1754, tensions boiled. At Jumonville Glen, his party encountered a small French force. On May 28, 1754, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, the French commander, was killed. The English called it a battle, the French an assassination. Washington was later forced to surrender at Fort Necessity on July 3, 1754, signing terms acknowledging he had assassinated Jumonville. This act set the ball of war rolling. The subsequent invasion of Saxony by Prussian King Frederick II in Europe then drew the major powers into this bloody worldwide conflict.
You called it our planet's first world war.
It really was, expanding over 3 continents. European powers sought worldwide influence, while local nations often fought simply for survival.
And India became a major, often brutal, theater of this war, with Robert Clive's pivotal victory at Plassey.
In India, the war began with a significant setback. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the governor of Bengal, captured Fort William in Calcutta, the British East India Company's home. This led to the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident, where 123 of 146 imprisoned Englishmen died in dismal conditions. Determined for revenge, British officer Robert Clive secured a secret weapon, essentially betrayal, by forging alliances with local officials discontented with Siraj-ud-Dowlah, including Mir Jafar. At the Battle of Plassey in June 1757, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's forces, though larger, were poorly coordinated. When Mir Jafar's forces defected, the tide turned. British secured victory, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and executed, and Mir Jafar was installed as a puppet ruler under British influence.
And the French were eventually pushed out.
Yes, subsequent battles like Nagapatnam, the failed French siege of Madras, the decisive Battle of Wandiwash in 1760, where Colonel Eyre Coote defeated the French general Lally Tollendal, and the British capture of Pondicherry in 1761, effectively eliminating French power in the subcontinent.
Meanwhile, in North America, the French and Indian War component saw monumental British victories that dramatically reshaped the continent.
The British, under General Geoffrey Amherst, attacked Louisbourg in eastern Canada in 1758, capturing the fortress after a naval bombardment and siege. Though initially repelled at Fort Carillon, Amherst captured it in 1759, renaming it Fort Ticonderoga. The most dramatic moment came at Quebec in 1759. Major General James Wolfe executed a daring plan, scaling seemingly insurmountable cliffs to reach the Plains of Abraham.
The battle where both commanders died.
On September 13, 1759, a brief but furious clash ensued. Both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm fell wounded. Wolfe died seeing the British victory. Quebec surrendered on September 18, 1759. By September 8, 1760, General Geoffrey Amherst's multi-pronged campaign encircled Montreal. The French were easily outnumbered, and the garrison capitulated, marking the complete end of French colonial rule in Canada. The British also seized Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, Grenada, and Havana in the Caribbean. The conclusion was unmistakable. It was clear to the world that the English were the ones to be in control.
And this unparalleled dominance was then formalized in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, truly marking the unquestioned peak of British global power.
The Treaty of Paris in 1763 was a testament to British military success. France agreed to cede Canada to the British Empire, with rights of French Roman Catholics protected. Spain traded Havana back to England in exchange for the swamplands of Florida. In India, the treaty reaffirmed British control of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. The British were on top of the world.
But even at this peak, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown, particularly with Pontiac's rebellion and the British response, which inadvertently alienated American colonists.
Britain, despite its victories, was reeling in debt after the 7 Years' War and sought to maintain peace with Native Americans to avoid further costly conflicts. This led to the Proclamation of 1763, creating a boundary line across the Appalachian Mountains, strictly prohibiting westward expansion by American colonists.
Which figures like Washington ignored.
Yes, the Ohio Company, under George Washington, blatantly ignored this. Odawa War Chief Pontiac and his allies, frustrated by British encroachment, laid siege to Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and Fort Sandusky in May 1763. The British were stunned by the coordination and ferocity. The Battle of Bushy Run showcased British resilience, but Pontiac's diplomacy kept the rebellion going until 1764, revealing deep fissures.
And the staggering financial debt from the 7 Years' War directly led to policies that would ignite the American Revolution, most famously the Stamp Act of 1765.
Yes, the Stamp Act of 1765 was a direct consequence of this debt. It required American colonists to place an embossed revenue stamp on virtually all printed documents, a direct tax to the British government. The colonists detested this, coining the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Though the Stamp Act was repealed, it was replaced by the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament hath, and of right ought to have, full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This showed the British felt they had the right to do whatever they wanted, setting a ticking time bomb.
And the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765, that seems like the official start of the British Raj, doesn't it?
It's certainly a major turning point. With the Mughal Empire in decline, the Treaty of Allahabad granted the English East India Company Diwani rights the right to collect taxes and administer land revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa on behalf of the emperor. In return, they paid a symbolic annual tribute. Essentially, the company gained control over these territories' economic and financial administration. Indians were now colonies of the British.
And in the midst of this imperial zenith, Captain James Cook made another monumental discovery, opening up a whole new frontier for the empire. Australia.
Describe Captain James Cook's 1768 mission on HMS Endeavour to explore the mysterious and vast South Pacific. In April 1770, he discovered an unexpected landmass, Australia, first landfall at Botany Bay, encountering indigenous people. Cook meticulously charted the eastern coastline, formally claiming New South Wales for Great Britain. As George Macartney, governor of Grenada, wrote, "This vast empire on which the sun never sets and whose bounds nature has not yet ascertained, summarizing the empire's global reach." This segment clearly marks the absolute high point of British expansion and dominance achieved through relentless warfare and strategic acquisitions. But it also profoundly highlights the growing friction with American colonists over autonomy and taxation, and the continued brutal subjugation of indigenous peoples globally, laying crucial groundwork for future conflicts and ultimately the empire's eventual decline.
So, after reaching its unquestioned zenith, the British Empire entered a period where the seeds of dissolution, sown in earlier conflicts and policies, truly began to sprout. The American Revolution, of course, stands as the empire's first major loss and a profound turning point.
It was a seismic event, not just for the British Empire, but for the very concept of colonial rule. The Declaration of Independence, signed in Philadelphia on July 4, 1776, was far more than a philosophical statement. It was, as our sources describe it, a scathing letter directed towards King George III with 27 reasons why they were revolting. The American founders passionately argued that their colonies were founded on fundamental principles of freedom by those who objected to the current religious or economic situation within the British mainland, seeking instead to create their own way of self-governance.
And the military struggle that followed was intense, with key battles like Saratoga proving absolutely pivotal.
Initially, British General William Howe dealt a significant blow, defeating George Washington's Continental Army at Long Island in August 1776 and retaking New York. But Washington's daring crossing of the Delaware River led to a surprise victory against Hessian mercenaries at Trenton in December 1776, boosting American morale. The true turning point came at Saratoga in September 1777.
Where Burgoyne's plan failed.
Exactly. American generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold decisively repelled British General John Burgoyne's plan to sever New England, ultimately forcing his entire army to surrender on October 17, 1777. This victory was crucial because it convinced King Louis XVI of France to formally join the war against Britain, forming a powerful and decisive Franco-American alliance.
Which ultimately led to the decisive siege of Yorktown, effectively ending the war.
In 1781, British General Lord Charles Cornwallis found himself strategically trapped on Yorktown Peninsula. The combined Franco-American forces under General George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau laid siege, while the French Navy decisively defeated the British fleet, completely blocking Cornwallis's escape routes by sea. After an intense bombardment, Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 17. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized America as an independent nation, creating a physical border between the free Americans and the British colonies of Quebec. This profound loss forced Britain to fundamentally rethink its imperial strategy.
With the loss of America, Britain clearly shifted its imperial focus, particularly towards India, formalizing a more direct and centralized rule with the establishment of the British Raj.
That's right. In the wake of the American Revolution, India became the primary jewel in the imperial crown. Prime Minister William Pitt passed the East India Company Act of 1784, which allowed the English East India Company to retain its financial control over Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. But crucially, political decisions were now managed by a secret six-person council selected by the king, known as the Board of Control.
Ruling without Indian representation.
Precisely. This council ruled over the Indian colonies without any form of representation from the Indian people. Learning from the American experience, this committee operated with minimal oversight and records, effectively able to do anything they pleased in a continent they barely knew. This marked a significant, almost covert step towards full, unadulterated imperial control, ensuring no repeat of the American scenario.
And Australia, discovered just a few decades prior, became the new destination for prisoners after America was lost as a penal colony.
Indeed. With America no longer available, the inhospitable desert land of Australia was chosen as the new destination for Britain's burgeoning prisoner population. Captain Arthur Phillip was tasked with guiding the First Fleet, consisting of 1,400 people, with about half being convicts, to New South Wales. The journey itself was grueling, over 24,000 kilometers lasting 8 months after departing Portsmouth on May 13, 1787.
Landing initially at Botany Bay, which wasn't ideal.
No. Their initial landing at Botany Bay was quickly deemed a horrible place by Phillip. It was open, had shallow water, scarce fresh water, poor soil, and the local Eora people were understandably suspicious. Phillip soon explored and discovered Port Jackson at Sydney Cove on January 26, 1788, which he hailed as the finest harbor in the world. This date is now celebrated as Australia Day. Despite the better location, the early European settlers struggled to survive in Australia's harsh, unpredictable climate facing famine. Yet Britain continued to send more and more prison hulks, establishing a brutal new form of colonization.
In Canada, though, Britain adopted a distinctly more accommodating approach, at least initially, by dividing it into Upper and Lower Canada.
Yes. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, many British loyalists and formerly enslaved people who had fought for the crown fled north to Canada. Meanwhile, Quebec was still home to a significant French-speaking population who sought to protect their culture. Rather than instigating conflict, the British Parliament passed the Constitution Act of 1791, which wisely divided Canada. Upper Canada, modern-day southern Ontario, became anglicized, accepting British common law and Anglicanism, serving as a haven for loyalists. Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec, maintained French civil law, French Catholicism, and the French language, allowing them to keep their culture entirely separate, despite being under British rule.
Though still no real representation in Parliament.
Correct. Both colonies gained a legislative assembly, but still did not have any parliamentary representatives. And it's important to note that for the formerly enslaved people who sought refuge in Canada, life remained quite hard, not equal, and they faced discrimination and poverty.
This also led to a unique initiative, the creation of Freetown in Sierra Leone, a haven for freed slaves.
British naval officer John Clarkson proposed Freetown in Africa as a place where former slaves would not have to deal with the cold, harsh Canadian winters and even harsher discrimination. So in February 1792, more than 1,100 former slaves got on a ship that sailed out of Nova Scotia back to their ancestral homeland, landing on March 9, 1792. They established Freetown as part of the Sierra Leone Company, marking a significant, if complex, step in the abolitionist movement.
And Britain continued its strategic acquisitions, taking the Cape Colony from the Dutch.
With Dutch rule in the Cape Colony at the southern tip of Africa ending, its strategic location as the gateway to the east became a highly coveted prize for European powers. Admiral Elphinstone led the British fleet to take over the colony from the Dutch in 1795, securing a vital maritime hub.
The Irish, meanwhile, continued their relentless resistance to British rule, leading to another major rebellion and ultimately the Act of Union in 1801.
Ireland was tired of being under the thumb of British rule, particularly with the ongoing decimation of their ancient language of Gaelic and their religious beliefs of Catholicism, despite growing tolerance elsewhere. A major rebellion erupted in May 1798, led by figures like Sean O'Brien and Wexford and Antrim. Despite fierce battles and even some aid from French forces, it was another failed Irish rebellion. To ensure the Irish would never revolt again, the British enacted the Act of Union on January 1st, 1801, formally dissolving the Irish Parliament and integrating it into the United Kingdom Parliament, which already included Wales, England, and Scotland. This created a seemingly unified Great Britain of four kingdoms, one union.
In India, British expansion continued relentlessly, systematically dismantling existing political structures, first with Mysore and then the Maratha Confederacy.
After Tipu Sultan of Mysore sought a French alliance against the English, British Governor-General Richard Wellesley recognized the potential danger and swiftly allied with the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Marathas. British forces, led by General Harris and Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, laid siege to Seringapatam. On May 4, 1799, Tipu Sultan fell fighting defending his city, and the resistance crumbled. Mysore was subsequently divided, and the Wudiyar dynasty was restored, but as puppet monarchs entirely beholden to the British.
And then the Marathas.
The British then turned their attention to the fragmented Maratha Confederacy, aiming for the final blow. Despite attempts by Peshwa Bajirao II to rebuild military might, internal divisions among Maratha chiefs weakened them. Governor-General Lord Hastings launched preemptive strikes, leading to decisive British victories at the Battle of Khadki in Pune in 1817 and the Battle of Sitabuldi in Nagpur. The Holkars faced continuous skirmishes, and the Scindias largely remained neutral. The Treaty of Maneswar in 1818 officially dismantled the Maratha Confederacy, annexing its remaining territories and abolishing the Peshawar title, ending the rule of a once great confederacy.
And the Gurkha Wars in Nepal also highlight how British strategic interests led to further expansion, even against formidable resistance.
The Gurkhas of Nepal had been expanding their territories, which the British East India Company viewed as a threat to their northern Indian frontiers. They also saw Nepal as a crucial strategic buffer against potential Chinese incursions. Border disputes over the Terai region escalated into war in 1814. The battle at Nalapani near Dehradun saw fierce Gurkha resistance under Commander Amar Singh Thapa, who held out against British advances for over a month. The British, unaccustomed to mountain warfare and initially underestimating the Gurkhas, were repelled repeatedly by effective guerrilla tactics. However, ultimately, British superior numbers, advanced weaponry, and strategic depth prevailed. The Treaty of Sugauli in 1815 forced Nepal to cede a significant portion of its western and eastern territories to the British.
And finally, a key acquisition for trade in Asia that would become one of the empire's most vital outposts.
Singapore. Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles was specifically tasked with finding a new Asian trading port to better navigate and control key trade routes. On January 29, 1819, he settled on Singapore. Its strategic position at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, its excellent natural harbor, fresh water supplies, and timber made it an ideal and invaluable acquisition, swiftly bringing this critical island under British control. This period demonstrates vast territorial gains for the British, often achieved through intense warfare and the systematic dismantling of existing political structures. It also highlights the growing pains of a truly vast empire, seen in the American Revolution's successful secession and the brutal realities of penal colonies and increasingly formal slave codes. The shift to more direct British control in India underscores the increasing formalization of imperial rule.
So, by the mid-19th century, the British Empire was still expanding, seemingly unstoppable. But it was also a time of significant shifts in global norms and internal British policy. We see some internal reforms, particularly concerning religious acceptance, but also continued brutal indigenous resistance and a strategic global economic strategy that drove aggressive military actions. Let's start with the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829.
This was a genuinely significant step towards greater internal religious acceptance within Britain itself. The Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829 legally allowed Catholics to serve in Parliament for the very first time. Daniel O'Connell, a prominent Irish Catholic leader, notably took his seat in the House of Commons within days of its passage. This marked a moment where some of the countless wars, resettlements, and prejudice against Anglicanism and Catholicism were starting to be resolved within the British Isles. Religious acceptance was, indeed, growing in the Isles.
But this progressive step back home stood in stark contrast to the empire's continued actions abroad, particularly in Tasmania.
Yes. Even as religious acceptance was growing in Britain, the fate of Aboriginal people in Australia was decidedly grim, as tragically seen in the Black War in Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as the British called it, from the 1820s to 1831. The indigenous Palawa people had inhabited Tasmania for millennia, but the increasing number of British settlers made it incredibly difficult for the Palawa to survive, leading to occasional raids for food and settler retaliation, escalating into a cycle of violent skirmishes, kidnappings, and killings.
The Black War.
A conflict grimly termed the Black War. Lieutenant Governor George Arthur declared martial law, essentially allowing settlers to kill Palawa on sight. In 1830, a large-scale attempt called the Black Line, a human chain of settlers, convicts, and troops, aimed to drive the Palawa into the Tasman Peninsula for isolation. It was largely ineffective and costly. By 1831, under the guise of Christianity, all remaining Palawa were forcibly moved to Flinders Island, where most died due to disease, malnutrition, and despair decimating their population.
Then, a truly landmark moment. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. A monumental moral step forward for Britain, but with a deeply problematic financial aspect, wouldn't you say?
It was, without question, a landmark piece of legislation passed on August 28, 1833. It gradually emancipated all slaves throughout the British Empire within 6 years. This marked a significant moral shift. However, the deeply problematic aspect you mentioned is crucial and often overlooked. The Act provided an astonishing £20 million, approximately £2 billion in today's money, to compensate slave owners for losing their property.
But nothing for the enslaved people themselves.
Critically, no. The former slaves did not receive any of this money for themselves. Instead, they were forced to fend for themselves with no assets, no land, and often no means of support after generations of brutal forced labor. This highlights the empire's prioritization of property rights for slave owners over the human dignity and well-being of the formerly enslaved.
And Australia continued to be a focus for colonization during this time, with some rather dubious land acquisitions like the infamous Batman's Treaty.
Yes. In 1835, explorer John Batman discovered what he called Batmania. He then engaged in what became known as Batman's Treaty with the local Aboriginal Kulin Nation, claiming to purchase 600,000 acres of land for simple trinkets. This questionable transaction illustrates the colonial mindset. This period saw further expansion. In 1836, the colony of South Australia was officially proclaimed, and Adelaide was founded. Further explorations encouraged more settlers, leading to the official recognition of the colony of Victoria in 1837, with Batmania renamed Melbourne.
The British also engaged in the Opium Wars in China, a series of aggressive military actions driven purely by economic interests and the desire to force open new markets.
This is a stark example of raw economic power driving imperial conflict. The British had developed an immense demand for Chinese tea, creating a significant trade imbalance, as the British didn't have anything worth that the Chinese desired in return, except for Indian opium. This highly addictive drug was smuggled into China, devastating Chinese society. The Qing dynasty appointed Lin Zexu to eradicate the opium trade, leading to the dramatic confiscate and destroy policy, and tons of confiscated opium set ablaze on Guangzhou beaches.
Which the British saw as a violation of trade rights.
Exactly. They sent their navy, bolstered by ironclad steam-powered gunboats, to protect British interests. Their superior naval power was overwhelming against Chinese defenses steeped in traditional warfare. The resulting Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was a bitter pill for the Chinese, heavily skewed in favor of the British. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong, pay a hefty indemnity, and critically open up their ports to the British so that they could legally sell their opium.
And New Zealand saw the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, a document whose disputed translation had profound and lasting consequences for the Maori people.
The Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, drafted by Lieutenant Governor William Hobson, was intended to secure British sovereignty over New Zealand. However, a crucial inaccurate Maori translation caused immense and lasting tension.
The difference between sovereignty and governance.
Precisely. The English version stated Maori ceded sovereignty, but the Maori version translated this as Kawanatanga, meaning governance, implying Maori chiefs thought they were giving up administrative rights, not supreme power. Similarly, the guarantee of undisturbed possession of all their properties became Tino Rangatiratanga Taonga, meaning full authority over treasures, tangible and intangible. The British enforced their version, aggressively buying land based on the European system, despite the Maori not having the concept of individual land ownership.
And this blatant discrepancy, this act of perceived deception, led to fierce resistance.
It did. Maori chief Honheke quickly realized the implications and, in a powerful, bold act of defiance, repeatedly felled the Union Jack on Mikey Hill, not once but 4 times. This led to Kororareka, modern-day Russell, becoming a battleground in March 1845. After intense fighting, including the HMS Hazard's captain being killed by a Maori sniper, the British retreated and the town was consumed by flames. The British sent more troops, and fighting with the Maori continued for decades through the Waikato War, Taranaki Wars, and Takuti's War, but ultimately, nothing could fend off the British.
And finally, the British completed their annexation of the Sikh Empire in India, further cementing their control over the subcontinent.
The Sikh Empire in Punjab faced a succession crisis, with the Sikh army, Khalsa, gaining power and becoming a military state. They moved towards the Sutlej River, the border with British India, which the British interpreted as provocative. The first military engagement at Mudki in December 1845 saw a British victory despite considerable losses. At Firoz Shah, the British claimed a hard-fought victory only after reinforcements. The Treaty of Lahore forced Sikhs to cede territory and pay reparations.
But peace didn't last.
No. Sikh leaders Maharaja Duleep Singh and Dewan Mulraj wanted their land back. The Battle of Gujarat saw a decisive British victory through overwhelming artillery and coordinated assault. The Second Treaty of Lahore in March 1849 formally deposed Maharaja Duleep Singh, and the empire was annexed into the British East India Company's territories. Punjab was officially under British control. This period truly shows a complex mix of progress, like Catholic emancipation and slave abolition, existing alongside continued brutal imperial expansion. The Black War, the Treaty of Waitangi, and the Opium Wars exemplify the ruthless pragmatism and economic imperatives driving the empire.
As the mid-19th century gave way to the early 20th, the British Empire stood at its high noon, a seemingly unshakable global power. Yet this was also the period when the early shadows of its sunset truly began to lengthen, starting with fundamental changes in India, particularly Lord Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse and the devastating Indian Rebellion of 1857.
This was a critical turning point for British rule in India, shifting it irrevocably towards direct imperial control. Lord James Dalhousie, the Governor-General, introduced the controversial doctrine of lapse policy. This asserted that if a ruler of a dependent state died without a recognized direct heir or was deemed incompetent, the British would gain full control.
Like with Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi.
Exactly. Her adopted son wasn't recognized, leading to Jhansi's annexation. Satara, Jaipur, Samapur, Nagpur, Awadh were similarly annexed, fueling deep resentment across India.
And this resentment, combined with other grievances among the sepoys, ultimately boiled over into the monumental Indian Rebellion.
Absolutely. The sepoys faced issues like lower pay and poor treatment. The hanging of Mangal Pandey, who mutinied in March 1857, lit the fuse. On May 10, 1857, in Meerut, 85 sepoys openly rebelled, stormed the jail, killed British officers and Europeans, and marched to Delhi. There, they joined local infantry and civilians, seizing the Red Fort and declaring the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as their symbolic leader. The defense of Delhi became a powerful symbol of honor, a shared legacy, and a dream of freedom.
But the British response, once mobilized, was swift and brutal.
It was indeed. British forces under General Archdale Wilson assembled outside Delhi, launching relentless bombardment. In September, General John Nicholson stormed the Kashmir Gate, turning Delhi's narrow alleys into mazes of combat. By September 20, the British had regained control. Bahadur Shah Zafar II was captured, marking a poignant end to the Sepoys' rebellion and the rule of the Mughal dynasty. British retribution was swift and unforgiving, with many rebels executed.
And this directly led to the end of the East India Company and the start of the British Raj.
Correct. The Government of India Act 1858 officially ended the British East India Company and replaced it with the British Raj, placing India under the direct control of the monarch Queen Victoria. A Council of India, composed of 15 people, none speaking native Indian languages, was given tyrannical controls. British governors were appointed, and English schools were set up for whites, based on the belief that British superiority gave them the right to rule over all of India. Their power had only grown, but it was built on fear.
Beyond India, other territories also resisted British control, like New Zealand and Jamaica, leading to further consolidation of British power through suppression.
In New Zealand, the New Zealand Settlements Act of 1863 allowed the government to confiscate land from the Maori tribes deemed to have rebelled. Despite Maori attempts to unite, Waikato War, Taranaki Wars, Takuti's War, the British ultimately prevailed. In Jamaica, decades after abolition, the island was mainly populated by poor former slaves with severely restricted voting rights. Tensions, exacerbated by drought and disease, exploded in the Morant Bay Rebellion on October 11, 1865.
Led by Paul Bogle.
Yes. A minor altercation escalated, the courthouse was burned, officials killed. Governor Edward John Eyre declared martial law. As many as 1,000 black Jamaicans were killed by British forces, many flogged. Bogle and George William Gordon were executed. Afterwards, the British government dissolved the Jamaican House of Assembly, replacing it with a British-appointed governor, giving London complete control of all Jamaican policies.
This era also saw some restructuring of existing colonies, like the formation of the Dominion of Canada.
Yes, in 1867, the British restructured their 6 separate colonies in Canada into the singular Dominion of Canada. This was a significant move towards greater self-governance for its white settler colonies, reflecting a different imperial policy for populations of European descent, while still maintaining allegiance to the crown.
But the greatest 19th century extension of British power took place in Africa, marked by the infamous Scramble for Africa and a series of often brutal wars and acquisitions.
The Scramble for Africa was a period of intense European colonization, and Britain was at the forefront. The Ashanti Wars in the Gold Coast, Ghana, from 1873-1874, saw the Ashanti challenge British influence. Sir Garner Wolseley, with modern rifles and cannons, defeated them. The Treaty of Falmina made Ashanti a British protectorate, retaining some internal autonomy. In contrast, Chief Kakabao of Fiji voluntarily ceded sovereignty in 1874, seeing a British protectorate as a way to ensure stability.
And the Suez Canal became a truly vital acquisition, highlighting Britain's strategic economic interests globally.
Absolutely. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, was revolutionary for offering a shorter sea route to India. When Egypt's ruler, Ismail Pasha, fell into extraordinary debt, British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli seized the opportunity in 1875, buying 44% of the canal shares for £4 million, $378 million today. This tilted decisively the balance of power over the Suez Canal to Britain.
The Zulu War in southern Africa also highlighted the intense clash between indigenous resistance and superior British firepower.
In 1878, Sir Henry Bartle Frere sent an ultimatum to Zulu King Cetshwayo, believing the Zulus were getting too strong. Cetshwayo chose to fight. At Isonzolwana in January 1879, the Zulu Impi overran the British camp in an unprecedented victory, killing over 1,300 British soldiers. A shocking defeat.
But temporary.
Yes. As the sources note, spears and shields can't beat muskets and helmets in the long run. British technological superiority prevailed at Kambula and Jinganlovu. At Olindi, in July 1879, the British delivered a decisive blow, capturing the Zulu capital, gaining even more control in South Africa.
But the First Boer War was a surprising setback for the British, showcasing the effectiveness of local resistance.
In December 1880, the Boers declared the Gold Ridge Transvaal independent. Using effective guerrilla tactics, they ambushed British troops and delivered a monumental defeat at Majuba Hill in February 1881, killing their commander. The intensity of Boer resistance led to the Treaty of Pretoria in March 1881, returning Transvaal to Boers, but under British sovereignty, a rare British military defeat by colonists.
And Britain's strategic interests, particularly in the Suez Canal, also led to their direct occupation of Egypt.
Egypt was deeply in debt. Ahmed Irabi, an Egyptian army officer, led a nationalist revolt against European influence and Suez control, gaining broad-based support. Britain, viewing this as a threat, intervened militarily. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir in 1882 saw British troops defeat Irabi's army decisively. Irabi was exiled, and Egypt became a de facto British protectorate under British influence for decades.
Then we have the infamous Berlin Conference, which literally carved up Africa without any African representation.
In November 1884, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck invited 14 European representatives to Berlin to discuss the colonization of Africa. The motivation was political power, military advantage, and avoiding war among themselves. Germany proposed effective political control for claims. Britain, however, pushed for any European nation could claim whatever land it liked with no repercussions, similar to their India policy.
And no Africans were consulted.
Crucially, no, there was no representation of Africa. Africa was just a map that needed more European flags, with no regard for cultures or tribes. Trades were made. Germany acknowledged British Zanzibar, Britain acknowledged German Tanzania. This helped Britain gain massive control, leading to Bechuanaland Protectorate, the British East African Company, Kenya-Uganda, the British South Africa Company, Zimbabwe-Zambia, and further gains via the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty.
And the drawing of these arbitrary lines inevitably led to brutal suppressions of indigenous people who resisted.
Inevitably. British forces under Cecil Rhodes, armed with Maxim guns, confronted the Ndebele people. The capital Bulawayo was surrounded and renamed Rhodesia, and Ndebele revolt in 1896 was brutally suppressed. In the Benin Kingdom, Nigeria, in 1897, after an unauthorized British official was ambushed and killed, Admiral Sir Harry Rawson led a swift and brutal response with Maxim guns. Benin City was aflame, its sacred bronzes pillaged as trophies of conquest. Benin was annexed.
The Fashoda incident in Sudan, though, shows how close European powers came to fighting each other over African territory.
Remote Fashoda was claimed by Britain, but French Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand placed a French flag there. British General Sir Herbert Kitchener saw this as a transgression. A tense standoff ensued. Both commanders realized a single gunshot could ignite a war. They met respectfully. Diplomacy in Europe resolved it. France withdrew, ending their eastward ambitions.
And finally, the Second Boer War, a conflict that revealed new depths of brutality with the implementation of the scorched earth policy in concentration camps.
Gold found in Boer territories escalated tensions into open conflict in October 1899. Boers used guerrilla tactics, besieging British towns. British commanders Lord Roberts and Lord Kitchener implemented a scorched earth policy. Widespread burning of Boer farms and the destruction of their crops to target logistical and moral support.
And the concentration camps.
To prevent aid to fighters, British began relocating Boer civilians, predominantly women, children, and the elderly, to concentration camps. These camps had deplorable conditions: malnutrition, poor sanitation, and diseases like typhoid fever, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands. Despite the high humanitarian cost, the policy wore down the Boer resistance. The Treaty of Reinaging in May 1902 made the Boer republics a part of the British Empire. This segment powerfully illustrates the empire at its peak acquisition, but also the escalating human cost and moral compromises. The Indian Rebellion reshaped rule, while horrors like the Black War, Morant Bay, and Boer concentration camps stain the record. The Berlin Conference reveals arbitrary partition. The Fashoda incident signals shifting European dynamics. This era marks maximal reach, but also reveals pressures leading towards decline.
So we've arrived at the 20th century. The British Empire is at its absolute peak, seemingly unshakable. Yet as we look closer, we see the cracks forming. This is the era of the world wars and ultimately the irreversible process of decolonization. Let's start with the Imperial Conference of 1907 and the emergence of what were called dominions.
In 1907, Britain began to subtly change its relationship with some of its larger white settler colonies. At the Imperial Conference, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland were granted unprecedented rights to rule themselves. This dominion status meant they were formally still under the crown and part of the empire, maintaining allegiance, but they gained significant autonomy over their internal affairs. This was a crucial step, foreshadowing a broader shift towards self-governance within the empire.
And as the world moved towards the precipice of World War I, Britain's economic strategy in the Middle East, particularly concerning the discovery of oil, played a significant, if often overlooked, role.
This is a crucial pre-war dynamic. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 had already divided Persia into spheres of influence, with Britain controlling the oil-rich southeast. The discovery of a massive oil reserve in Majid-e-Suleiman, Persia, in 1908 was a game-changer. This led to the rapid formation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1909, whose initial stocks sold out in just 30 minutes, highlighting the immense value of this new resource.
Fueling the need for control in the region.
Exactly. This discovery significantly heightened British interest in increasing control in the region, particularly eyeing the fledgling Ottoman Empire, which still controlled much of the Middle East. As our sources put it, this growing strategic imperative, particularly for oil, created a powerful motivation for intervention, and that's why they needed a world war.
And World War I, described as a battle of worldwide colonization, proved to be the beginning of the end for the British Empire.
It was. The war pitted the Triple Entente France, Russia, and Britain against the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. While Germany and France aimed to expand their empires, Britain sought to expand and protect its own vast holdings, and the Ottomans desperately struggled to retain theirs. Early engagements, like the Battle of Mons, saw the British Expeditionary Force confront Germans, quickly descending into the grim reality of trench warfare. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the Dardanelles, involving British, Australian, and New Zealand forces, aimed to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, but became a drawn-out ordeal with rugged terrains, stiff enemy resistance, and immense casualties.
And even during the war, there were secret agreements already carving up the spoils of a potential victory.
Yes. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret accord between Britain and France, carved up the Middle East for post-war control, with France designated to receive Syria and Lebanon, and Britain acquiring Jordan, southern Iraq, and much of Palestine. On the Western Front, battles like the Somme in July 1916 became horrific symbols of the war's futility and devastation, with immense casualties on all sides. After initial German gains during their 1918 spring offensive, the Hundred Days Offensive by the Allies pushed them back relentlessly, leading to the armistice in November.
And when the dust settled, the Treaty of Versailles formalized Britain's seemingly triumphant, yet ultimately Pyrrhic, victory.
The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 forced Germany to surrender all its colonial territories. Tanganyika went to the British, Cameroon and Togoland became a joint French-British coalition. Nauru and German New Guinea were placed under joint British-Australian mandate. Crucially, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement was fully realized, with Britain gaining new mandates in the Middle East. On paper, the British Empire stood at its peak after WWI, having gained more territory than ever before.
But the cost was immense.
Exactly. Little did they know the sun was finally setting. The war, though won, left Britain economically devastated, drained of resources and manpower, effectively serving as the final bullet in the empire. Its former colony, America, was now poised to become the next great empire on the global stage.
This economic devastation and the ideological impact of World War I profoundly fueled rising nationalism and a determined push for decolonization, particularly evident in India, with Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance.
After contributing immense resources and soldiers to WWI, India felt tired of being ignored and demanded greater self-rule. The British responded with the Rowlatt Act in 1919, which allowed police to arrest individuals without reason, trial, or evidence, severely curtailing civil liberties. The arrest of popular nonviolence leaders sparked widespread peaceful protests. It was in this climate that Mahatma Gandhi introduced Satyagraha, polite insistence on truth, a powerful philosophy of nonviolent resistance.
But the British response was often brutal, like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
Yes. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre in April 1919 in Punjab saw Brigadier General Reginald Dyer surround a peaceful gathering and order his riflemen to shoot until ammunition ran out, killing 1,500 people. This horrific event starkly raised the question for many: is nonviolence really the answer?
Ireland, meanwhile, chose a very different path, leading to an armed struggle for independence.
In the 1918 general election, Sinn Féin, led by Eamon de Valera, won 73 of 105 Irish seats, signaling an overwhelming demand for a united and independent Ireland. In January 1919, they declared independence and formed the Irish Republican Army, IRA, under Michael Collins, to militarily resist British rule. The British sent black and tans to quell the resistance, leading to a brutal Irish War of Independence.
But events like Bloody Sunday?
Yes. Bloody Sunday in November 1920 saw the IRA kill 14 British agents, prompting horrific black and tans retaliation at Croke Park, killing 14 civilians. After intense fighting, a treaty was negotiated in 1921. An Irish parliament was established, swearing allegiance to the monarch but governing independently. However, 6 northern Anglican counties chose to remain part of the British Empire, forming their own country, leading to Ireland's bitter separation.
The power of nonviolence, however, continued to gain momentum in India, most famously with the iconic Salt March.
The British Raj had imposed a deeply resented salt tax, making it illegal for Indians to produce or sell salt without a license, a stark reminder of a colonial rule. On March 12, 1930, Mahatma Gandhi and 78 residents began a 240-mile march to Dandi. On April 6, Gandhi declared, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire by scooping up mud and salt." This sparked mass civil disobedience across India, with millions breaking salt laws and boycotting British goods.
Despite mass arrests.
Yes. Despite British arrests of over 60,000 people and new oppressive laws, none of those measures slowed the civil disobedience movement. These persistent efforts eventually led to the Government of India Act 1935,
Mhm.
which allowed India to partially rule itself, with an Indian representative gaining power and their first election held in 1937.
But then, an even larger global conflict, World War II, erupted, delivering the ultimate and decisive blow to the British Empire.
Britain declared war after Germany invaded Poland in 1939. The initial phony war ended in 1940 as the German blitzkrieg pushed British forces to Dunkirk, leading to the Operation Dynamo Rescue. The Battle of Britain saw relentless bombing, but Churchill declared Britain would never surrender. U.S. support, Lend-Lease, began in 1941, becoming full alliance after Pearl Harbor. The tide turned in 1942, Frigi, El Alamein, though Singapore fell to the Japanese, a major imperial loss. Crucial operations continued until the D-Day landings in 1944, the beginning of the end for Hitler's Europe.
And the war's end sealed the empire's fate.
Victory in Europe came in May 1945, but the war continued until August after the atomic bombs. As our sources state, with the fall of Hitler, the interest in large colonial empires was done. Despite winning, Britain was economically devastated. WWII was the final bullet in the empire. Its former colony, America, would become the next great empire.
And the final decades of the 20th century saw the winding down of the empire, with Hong Kong's handover in 1997 as perhaps the most poignant and symbolic moment.
The decolonization process accelerated rapidly post-WWII. In 1947, Sir Louis Mountbatten oversaw the independence and partition of India and Pakistan. Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Burma, Myanmar, followed in 1948. The 1950s and 1960s saw widespread African independence. Ghana, 1957, under Kwame Nkrumah, then Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and others, often led by leaders educated in the very heart of the empire. Malaya became independent in 1957. Caribbean nations like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago gained freedom. In the 1980s, Robert Mugabe's guerrillas fought against rule in southern Rhodesia, resulting in a free Zimbabwe.
And finally, Hong Kong.
Perhaps the most pregnant moment came in 1997 in Hong Kong. The Union Jack was lowered, the Red Star of China rose. Prince Charles represented an empire bidding farewell to its last significant outpost, a truly symbolic end. This segment vividly chronicles the complex end of the British Empire, hastened by the devastating world wars that weakened Britain economically and ideologically. It shows the varied paths to independence, from non-violent civil disobedience to armed struggle, and how the dominions gained self-rule much earlier, all leading to the eventual dismantling of this colossal global power.
What an incredible, sprawling journey we've just taken. From its very first tentative efforts in the 16th century, expanding through, well, a complex mix of commercial ambition, religious drive, and often brutal conquest, to its 19th century peak, where it comprised nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and more than 1/4 of its total population, the British Empire was a global force unlike any other. And then we witnessed its ultimate decline and dissolution in the 20th century, culminating with the return of Hong Kong in 1997. This colossal system, however, didn't simply vanish. It transformed, gradually developed into the Commonwealth, where former dependencies gained full sovereignty but largely retained voluntary ties to the United Kingdom.
The British Empire was undeniably the largest, richest, and most powerful empire in world history. But as we've seen throughout this deep dive, a complex interplay of factors, both internal and external, brought about its ultimate decline. What remains is a profound and complex legacy, one that continues to shape our world.
Definitely. The effects of colonization are not confined to history books. They are still tangible realities.
Yeah.
We've touched on land stolen from the natives, the lines arbitrarily drawn in Africa, and the stolen artifacts held in British museums. These are not just historical footnotes. They are realities whose effects could be still felt around the world today, influencing geopolitics, national identities, and individual experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a history that's still very much alive in its consequences.
And that really brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. As the darkness of the night covers the London sky, who knows what'll be in store for the United Kingdom? Their history is still being written. We encourage you to reflect on how the threads of this vast historical phenomenon continue to shape global dynamics and national identities even today, inviting you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into the reverberations of history.